Hey everyone. Just wanted to get some thoughts out there about the crossovers that are going to be happening and what it means for Magic the Gathering and the flavor of the game. And I guess, per usual, my overall message is going to be, don't freak out. It's really not going to be that big a deal. And there's some precedents that might give you a little bit of comfort, and we'll go over some of that. Going back to Portal 3 Kingdoms, I mean, this is a set that basically has, like, no magic to it. It's a Romance of the Three Kingdoms, and it's basically a myth/history interwoven as an oral tradition and written tradition of the Chinese culture. It's basically like their history, but it has these legendary figures and events that are kind of exaggerated, so to speak, kind of like a mythological telling of their history. And they just turned it into a card game because they wanted to reach a new market, which they did. China is a huge market. The other Asian countries, it is a huge market. We're talking about Japan, Korea. I mean, it's gigantic in Japan. Forgetting about all of the other places in Asia, Japan is an incredible market for all card games for a lot of reasons, culturally, but also the space of the island. Of course, geography is always tied into culture as well. But the size of the island means that card games are a fantastic way of having fun because they don't take up very much space. So very conscious of a footprint when it comes to a space commitment for games there. But, we're talking about a game of Commander. You can have Xiaoyu Dun, the One-Eyed. That has nothing to do with magic lore. There's no planeswalking in this set. There's really not any magic. And, the game just keeps on going. It doesn't ruin your game of Commander when this guy shows up. And I just don't think it's that big a deal. Now, the other part to consider is there really aren't that many cards from P3K that end up seeing play in Legacy. And that's kind of an important point, is the bar is super high. So with this Lord of the Rings and 40K crossover, which I guess I should have explained, that's precisely what I'm talking about here, bar is pretty high. So for things that actually see play in Legacy, and we got a handful of cards that actually are good enough to make the cut. And honestly, I mean, the last year, a lot of the stuff that's been good enough to make the cut ends up getting banned. Like it's kind of like, this is obviously ridiculous, or it's not really even a consideration. So for kind of booster releases, I mean, I wouldn't worry about it nearly as much as the online outrage, kind of anger-fueled response would have you inclined to do. It's just really not going to be that big a deal. Imperial Seal, another example of a P3K card. Again, nothing to do with the flavor of Magic. Warrior's Oath, it's got the whole Asian feel to it, and it doesn't really ruin things. Another example here, like the San Diego Comic-Con zombie cards. I mean, this is another way that the lore is different. I mean, Nissa dead as a zombie is not canon. Like that is a non-canonical card, so to speak, but it's totally legal. And if that ruins your day, then I guess you can rule 0 and just be like, oh, I don't like these cards because I don't like the flavor. But I don't know. It's kind of like an altar. Like, at the end of the day, if you're a tournament player and we're talking about sitting down and playing and trying to find the best deck possible, the task at hand is winning. It's not so much making aesthetic judgments about the cards that your opponent's playing or complaining that you're, kind of feel like you're forced to play cards that you don't like the look of. I mean, I suppose you could get them altered. But the big one, which makes this whole thing comical to me, is the very first expansion for Magic the Gathering completely broke the universe. Arabian Nights has nothing to do with the Magic the Gathering universe. So the precedence was literally set with the very first expansion. And this set, they actually had, initially they were going to have purple backs to the cards. They were going to make it so, if you wanted to play with just Arabian Nights cards, you could do that, or, you could mix and match it with the other Magic the Gathering sets. And at the last minute, they decided to keep them all with the same back, so you couldn't tell which cards you were going to be drawing from the set, which ultimately was a brilliant decision. But keep in mind, like, Allah is a earth term. That is just a term for God. And I mean, there it is. That's like earthly religions represented there. Or Bazaar of Baghdad, one of the most iconic cards in the game. That is a pillar of vintage. And Baghdad right there just completely KOs the flavor, but everyone's used to it. I mean, if this card came out today, people would lose their ever-loving minds. I mean, if Arabian Nights came out today, there would also be a cultural issue as well. I'm sure people would be offended by the inclusion of that. I'm not going to weigh in on that. I think that's kind of comical. I think it might actually be the opposite of what people are going for. But, I mean, that's neither here nor there for now. Maybe I'll do a video on that type of concept at some point if people are really interested in my take on that. But, you know, Bazaar of Baghdad, Library of Alexandria, real-world places from Earth in Magic the Gathering. No magic in these particular settings, though the rest of Arabian Nights did have magical elements. There were jinns and, flying men and different things that had magical aspects, though, no planeswalkers. They'd already established planeswalkers in the idea of Urza, as well as in the Alpha rulebook. There was a couple of other names, if I recall correctly. But this is really, it's a little bit different. I'm not gonna completely diminish it. There is potential, as always, for things to go horribly wrong, but every single set is potential for things to go entirely wrong. They can print cards that can ruin the gameplay, and that is what I would be much, much more worried about. I don't worry about it because it can be addressed if it's a problem. But at the end of the day, as long as the game is good, that's all that really matters in the end. I think reaching new players is going to be worth the cost. I think P3K is a perfect example of what happens when you try and reach new players beyond just your current player base. And it was a smashing success in that regard in terms of opening the door. Now, the set itself didn't go over particularly well, but it did open the door and show goodwill and kind of help establish those markets. Even if it wasn't the most successful bid to do that, it still is part of that. And ultimately, I think having it be a worldwide game is a much, much better thing than just having this be a game that only takes place in the U.S. And, the market's a big part of that, too. The fact that, there's a huge European market, there's a huge Japanese market, that is not to be dismissed. I used to be able to take trips to Europe entirely financed by the fact that the exchange rate was different and the demand was different. So when I'd go over there, I would be able to move any type of Eternal cards that I had, guaranteed. Like Juzam Jins and stuff, which really weren't a big deal stateside. I would spend the time prior to heading over there just getting as many copies of cards like that as I could. And then when I'd land there, they would be buying them literally in US dollar prices. If a gin was $100 back then, they'd pay 100 euros, which was $125 US. It was phenomenal. So having that difference also ensures that the cards are going to have value. There's more demand for the cards, and that's ultimately best for everybody that's in the game, making sure that cards have that type of liquidity where this is a game where you're actually investing compared to consuming. And that's ultimately another thing that makes Magic just the best tabletop game that's been made. You don't have to be the absolute best in the world like in poker where you're just going to be hemorrhaging money unless you're just an absolute monster. You can play Magic at the kitchen table and buy cards judiciously, keep them in good condition, take care of them, and ultimately have some prosperity there because it's essentially saving money at that point. It's not so much that you're consuming, but you've got a balance sheet with your entire net worth, and just a segment of it becomes Magic cards instead of excess money that would be potentially in a bank account or, spent on some lesser hobby. So the sun looks like it's trying to get me off the stage here, but those are my initial thoughts. This 40K and Lord of the Rings stuff, hopefully the cards are good. Like, let's hope for that. Let's reserve some judgment until we actually see the cards. And ultimately, if it's not going to be good enough to play in Legacy, it's a non-issue. If you're really concerned about flavor, there's a reasonable chance that some of those cards might not feel totally out of place, like Imperial Seal or Imperial Recruiter. Currently in Magic really don't feel that far out of whack. And, Lord of the Rings could certainly have some type of, ring wraith or something. You could have a ring wraith in Magic without it feeling completely wrong. So we'll see. I say reserve judgment until the cards come out. I don't think it's the end of the world. Remember that there is precedence for worlds beyond the Magic lore already set. And that's it. Let's give it a chance and hope that it brings in lots of new players, because ultimately that's what we want. We want an actually diverse player base engaging with the hobby. And that means putting stuff out there that might not be your favorite, but it's somebody else's favorite, and that gets them to the table. And I think that's tremendously valuable. I don't know. I mean, that's an incredibly difficult task to try and counterbalance that. But at the end of the day, that side of the scale has some serious weight on it when we're talking about all of the untapped potential and all the players that could come to Magic and have it be an even larger phenomenon that it already is. The sky's the limit. This is literally the best game that has been made that as far as tabletop goes. And I say that as a avid chess player and poker player. I mean, there's a lot of great games that are really tremendous, and Magic's the best of them. Here's to keeping it that way.